Hello and welcome to Modeling for an IP. This is a presentation done for YCFCG, who I thank for inviting me to do this presentation. And I'll just be talking about my experiences while modeling for different IPs in the games and entertainment industry. My name is Gino, and welcome. All right. As a quick introduction, first of all, I'm a creator. So, I'm a creative person. I make art, mostly 3D models. I'm a professional artist for games and entertainment, and I'm a freelancer. Below, you can see some of my personal work and some professional work. I've modeled and designed the creature on the left. The right is a cinematic model based off of a concept, and the center one is a model done for Baldur's Gate 3 while I was working at Larian Studios. These are some of my previous game projects that I participated in, only from 2017 to 2022 though. My more recent work is under NDA, as some of you might know. So let's start off. I worked on Ashes of Creation, Lost Soul Aside, Torchlight III, Street Fighter V, and Baldur's Gate 3. The four projects on the right were done through outsourcing, and the one on the left was as an in-house artist. Street Fighter V was my first project, and yeah. These are some of my personal works. So I really like doing fan art. I'm a big fan of Japanese designs and big creatures. I think it's important to both like know how to model off of a concept or a previously existing design, but also modeling your own stuff, right? So designing and modeling at the same time. I think it's of course hard and difficult, and I wouldn't recommend it for beginners. But if you're more advanced and you're like comfortable with modeling softwares and the medium in general, then I think making your own designs is definitely worthwhile. Um, yeah, and in both, you can test pipelines and new workflows, but on fan arts, it's a bit easier because you can just test stuff without having to think so much about, the design, which I think takes a long time. So I think there's a good balance between the two. And unique design, you practice your own like shape and form language and your concept generation skills, which can really help level you up as an artist overall. Okay, modeling for an IP. So in my experience, there's a few differences here between modeling for an existing IP or modeling for a new IP. But in both, you need to, do your research, know the function, the story, and you need to, set a certain 3D pipeline. In this case, I'm going to contrast Baldur's Gate 3, which is a IP made by Larian Studios, or yeah, a game made by Larian Studios. The IP is from Dungeons and Dragons, which is published by Wizards of the Coast, which is then owned by Hasbro, but yeah, you get the idea. And this here on the right is my own IP, Lacerta Windsong, which is basically, yeah, it's just my own creation. It's giant dragons versus giant robots in a sci-fi fantasy setting. All right. So when modeling for an existing IP, some things that I found to help quite a bit is asking yourself a few questions and obviously, doing a lot of research, right? But first off, you need to know who the audience is. Then you need to be aware of the approval loop, um, the key characteristics of the IPs, and the universe and setting. In these examples here, I have one of the first models I did professionally, which was a Street Fighter V Falke cat costume. So Falke is the character, and then there was a cat costume, which is a character from Breath of Fire, which is a different IP than Street Fighter V, right? So in this case, the audience were, well, the players of Street Fighter V. The approval loop was, in this case, quite difficult because I think I had to get the model approved by 4 people, basically. So I had to go through my lead. Then my lead had to go through the local art director. Then it would be sent out to Capcom, which would then take a look. And if the first team liked it, they would send it to the second team, which would then check if it, was aligned with their expectations for Breath of Fire, or what they would expect the character to look like in Street Fighter V. So that gets pretty complicated, of course, because you get contradicting feedbacks. You might have different people being on a different page. Like some might want, I don't know, the belt to be yellow, others would want it to be orange, right? Some might want the fur to be more bright, others would like it less, more muted, right? So there's a lot of decisions that go into this that I think are important to be aware of. Also, it's important to be aware that regardless of the feedback, it's just different people's opinions, right? That ultimately will hopefully make a better product for the game, right? Because ultimately what it's about is the end user, which is the player, right? As long as the player enjoys the skin, um, everything is good. Okay, for the second one, we have the Displacer Beast. So a Displacer Beast, for those who don't know, is a classic Dungeons and Dragons creature, which we had to put into Baldur's Gate 3, right? So we had a great concept artist that took a stab at the Displacer Beast, and then it was my task to translate the 2D sketch or concept art into a 3D model. Um, Now for Baldur's Gate 3, so you can see here in the left illustration, right? It looks a bit more stylized, maybe. It is less hairy. It's more like a panther with, yeah, 6 arms and the 2 tentacles, or 6 limbs rather. And our version was a bit more, I guess, different from a panther, right? We wanted to still have that panther vibe, but also detach it a bit from that, add a bit more fur, and just give it a slightly different look, because Baldur's Gate 3 was aiming mostly for realism, but also had a bit of stylization, I would say. And the approval loop here, so the audience, I mean, was, Dungeons and Dragons people, RPG players, and yeah, anyone who really likes, that kind of fantasy game. The approval loop in this case was just a lead, maybe the art director and the game director, but not as involved as it was in the Street Fighter V example, for instance. Key characteristics I already mentioned, fantasy, kind of realistic. Same for the universe, Dungeons and Dragons, right? So fantastical, but it still had to make sense, right? So here, the area where the tentacles and the 2 arms kind of connect, it was a bit difficult because the anatomy had to be really figured out in a way that it still looked kind of realistic instead of just staking 2 tentacles out there, right? I really wanted to give it a more muscular feel. And yeah, all right. For a new IP, these would be some of my examples from my personal IP. So here, same thing. I mean, in this case, you get more freedom, right? But at the same time, you need to take care of the story, setting, genre, world, and research yourself, right? Which makes it a bit more complex, because you need to, you need to write stuff, you need to take notes, you need to define certain rules for the world, you need to make sure you're in the genre that you want, and you need to research a lot of stuff, right? Because you need to know different types of anatomies, you need to know how machines work in this case, right? Like how mecha joints move, and is there magic or is there no magic? Is it all science fiction based, like technology? Different types of dragons and creatures. How does that work, right? The anatomy here again, it's also like you have 6 limbs essentially with a tail and a long neck. Um, and yeah, I also had to build the environments. So, there's a lot more that goes into it. But I think it's also a very rewarding process, of course. Okay, let's talk a bit more in depth about a few of the subjects I've mentioned so far. For research, it's basically you just grab references of forms, shapes, worlds, settings, even benchmarks. Anything that supports your vision is helpful, right? So you can see I have statues, I have real animals, I have illustrations, architectural illustrations, environment art, mood pieces. I have realistic references again of real life creatures, and then again some more mood pieces down here. And they all kind of, in my brain unify into a certain vision of what I want. And that really helps guide you, especially initially, right? I think it's just gathering images that you like, images that inspire you, things that you think are really cool that you would like to, do your own spin-off from. And yeah, it's the most important step. So usually, I think the process is always ongoing. I don't think there's always or ever a step where you go, okay, I've done enough research. I don't need any more information, right? Um, but it is good to like start at some point at also working on your stuff, right? So usually I will spend like, I don't know, a few hours gathering references for the specific thing that I want, right? So I might not use all these references for everything that I'm doing in the IP, but they are all on the same or different ref boards that I have. And I always open up a few and just, open them to spots where they're like relevant to the thing that I'm modeling. But yeah, very important step. Never skimp on research or reference. Function and story. So this is important for both, you know, existing IPs and if you're making your own. So you need to be aware of what the story or the purpose is, how it moves, what it does, which is like function, right? Function and purpose kind of overlap, and why does it exist? Um, so in this case here, we have Grim, the Keeper of the Forge. This was a boss, which was also released in early access, as you can see. Now, the goal was, the purpose was it was a boss fight, right? So it had certain functions that it had to fulfill during the boss fight. It has a weapon. It has, yeah, it can grab people as well, I think, and it can heat up and become like molten, like like a molten kind of shader effect, essentially. So it has gameplay that, needs to be supported by the visuals and the model. So that's all stuff that you need to take into account when creating the model, right? So in my case, the effects department needed to have the model earlier at some point when I was roughly done with the UVs, when I was still doing the textures, so that they could make their own maps to input for the shaders and stuff for the molten effect. Um, for how does it move, you need to check with your rigger early on. Best thing is once you have your block out done, you can send it over to them. They can run some tests, and from there you can see like if you need to adjust certain pieces, certain parts. Like hey, maybe the arm is too long, or right here, if he moves his arm, it's gonna clip. All that kind of stuff is something that the rigger can help you figure out. Of course, you can do it yourself. So here on the right, this is me doing some checks on how my mecha would move, essentially. This is my own design. So then in ZBrush, you just mask out certain parts, move them. You see, okay, where up to what point can I move them? What kind of rotation angles do I have? And what do I want to do with it in the IP, right? So if I want to fight dragons with this, I'm going to need a lot of mobility. So yeah, that's just important to test, right? So like angling the shoulders outwards, for instance, right? Making sure there's a joint there that allows for that kind of movement, all that kind of stuff. Um, Sometimes you make character outfits, right? These are more basic, but they also have a purpose, right? Like they need to dress the characters, the player character. They need to dress NPCs sometimes as well. And um, an important part in Baldur's Gate 3 was that we had a lot of races, so the outfit would have to be modeled to fit on all races, right? So you'd start by making a human version or an elf version, and then you would take the same armor that you then finished and essentially fit it to like a dwarf or a large human or a gnome, right? So those are all things that come into play later. So you need to be very organized by knowing the purpose, the function and why it exists. I think that can help you pre-plan every time when you're making something. And here we have the Steel Watchers. So the Steel Watchers, they had to, serve as guards. They had to have multiple color schemes, and they had to be used as environment set pieces later on. So this was something that I had to keep in mind when modeling, that each part, was separatable. So you see here, I think it's like a chest piece with a separated arm maybe. I know there's like certain parts where you see only the torso or only the leg because it's like a factory, right, of these steel watchers. So making sure that my pieces could be just used by the environment department and be like, yeah, placed all throughout the level to enhance the awesome environments that they were already making. And apart from that, of course, it had to have combat functions. It had to be able to move in certain ways. Yeah, required a lot of effort from a lot of different teams to get working. All right, the 3D pipeline. So let's just roughly go through the general stages. I'll go more in depth later on in the presentation. So first off, it's usually a concept, 2D or 3D, which represents the idea. It can be provided to you or you can make it yourself, right? So this is a case for like if you're doing a fan art, you essentially already have a concept. If you're making your own stuff, it's up to you to make it. So you need research, and then from there you just create something. The block out, you capture rough shapes, proportions, overall feel of the model. Essentially, it's like the silhouette and the rough anatomy. You don't need any details or anything to define. In the high poly stage, we just refine the block out, we polish it, we add details, clean up the model, make sure it's, prepared for baking, or if you're working for cinematics that you have your UVs on there, everything is clean, and you can just start projecting all those details onto a functional mesh essentially. The low poly, you remesh. The high poly, we create UVs that are well packed, and we, yeah, bake the information down in the texture stage later on. Nothing too complicated. The only thing in low poly is you have to watch out for your topology, especially on organic models, that everything deforms nicely, essentially. Textures, we bake the information down into the low poly and add, our color maps, AO, normal maps, all that kind of stuff, defining the material feel, and a few more details. So roughness, usually it's PBR workflows that we use in games. So, you have your classic albedo normal map, roughness, and metallic. Then sometimes you'll add emission maps or SSS maps, but it depends on the game you're modeling for or the system that you set up yourself. And last but not least, we render. So we place our model in a scene, light it, and take some nice shots. All right. Let's go a bit more in depth into concept. This can be 2D or 3D, as I mentioned previously. Both are valid. Concepts simply have to represent ideas, right? So I think that part is pretty important because sometimes you get concepts which are super rough sketches, and then you need to fill in the blanks, right? So filling in those gaps and blanks is a very creative exercise, but it's also difficult because, it takes a certain skill to complement someone's work and make sure that everything fits together. So that's why making your own stuff, I think, is a great practice because you get to learn this a lot. And things can change during the process. Sometimes they have to as well. So on the left, this is the Displacer Beast concept done by Tanya Burrow Civil, a great concept artist working at Larian. So this was the first exploration I think I saw from her about from the Displacer Beast. And it had these awesome, crazy, cool proportions, this very aggressive vibe, and yeah, just looked really cool. In the end, we ended up with this model, which is more tame, I think, compared to this, but we had certain limitations in terms of rigging, right? So for the Displacer Beast, the rig had to function not only for the Displacer Beast, but also for the other large cats in the game. So like the Saber-tooth or the Panther or, other big cats essentially. So I had to make sure that when I modeled it, that it looked good on this cat, but it also worked for the other large cats. So the position of the eyes, we couldn't go this crazy, for instance, because then we wouldn't have been able to model the other cats properly. We also added a bit more fur because it was looking like a little bit empty when we had it in 3D. So, there's always these kind of tweaks that you make as you translate something from 2D into 3D, which is fine as long as your lead and your art director and everyone else is aware of what you're doing, right? So keeping good communication with everyone in the loop is very important. And on the right, this is a blockout slash concept sketch that I did. And this here is the final model rendered in Unreal Engine 5. So you can see I generally kept everything here, but color changed. I changed the anatomy up a bit from this version as well on the paws mostly. The tail got, an extra shape in the back. And I also, opened the eyes. I figured out some more facial shapes. And I think the jaw changed slightly too, which is again fine. In this case, it's my own personal model, my own personal work, and changing stuff I think is fun. Sometimes you can spiral quite a bit, which can be bad, but I think that exploration is quite healthy sometimes because you end up with something that you like in the end, hopefully, right? And that's the most important thing. Okay, lockout. This is basically the 3D concept in this case. Sometimes you can check it into the game engine. So in Baldur's Gate 3, what we would do is we would block out a model roughly, right? Just a quick ZBrush sculpt. Then we would decimate it, send it into the game engine, and just check how it was looking, right? So like, okay, is the silhouette fine? Does it fit through the doors? Again, this goes back to like purpose and function of the model, right? So for a boss model, like you'd want to check, okay, how does this look in the environment, right? Is it big enough? Does it look intimidating? Does it fit in the sewer pipe that it comes out from? All these kind of little things have to work. You then capture forms, proportions, and the general idea of the character. You can also do some test rendering, which is also a great way to check like how how it reacts to lights, how it reacts to its surrounding environment. In this case, once I did my ZBrush model here, my quick blockout, I sent it into Blender, set up a basic shader setup, just using the vertex color that I painted here, then I tweaked it maybe a little bit, and just rendered it out to see, okay, how is it working? Does it work? Do I like how the light hits it from certain different angles? and what kind of shader do I want to put on these spikes, you know? So yeah, I'm gonna show you guys a quick time lapse in terms of my blockout process. All right, here we are. This is just a quick time lapse used or made rather by using the timeline at the top. So I saved the undo history for this model and I'm just working over it in reverse, so to speak. Although you're only seeing like separate parts of it. So you'll see how I'm adding like the outlines for the legs and the arms, but I am actually working on all of them in tandem at the same time. Um, but yeah, I just wanted to show this process. We'll go into ZBrush right after and I'll show you the model a bit more. But just to show you guys what is actually happening, right? Or what I actually do. It's a lot of exploration, but it always starts with, you know, the basic shape, the basic silhouette, and then just going in there and sculpting everything roughly, right? So, you know, here I know I want kind of a face that's kind of weird. It's not really animalistic so much. You know, I want big eyes. I'm starting to define the jaw a bit, creating the lower jaw. Um, I already had the idea or thought that I wanted to make it like insectoid, you know, like a mix between an insect and kind of like a dragon or something. So I'm just trying out different stuff here. And yeah, nothing too special. It's just a usual clay buildup, damp standard, clay masking, that kind of stuff. You know, here I'm grabbing arms from a previous sketch that I did, and yeah, just slotting them in, you know, because I am lazy of resculpting them each time. But especially for concepting, right? Like I refine the anatomy and stuff later on, but just to get an idea, like visualized from my head onto like the canvas, so to speak, I think it's worthwhile to just take pieces and use them, you know, as you can, like those legs, for instance, and the claws and stuff like that. Adding some scales, felt like it was missing something around the top, generally quite content with the rest of the shapes. And here I'm just adding in the spikes, and that's it. All right, here we are in ZBrush. Um, so this is the same model you guys just saw in that blockout stage, right? So you see like everything is super rough. You know, there's topology messes everywhere, but it doesn't really matter because I clean all of that up in the high poly stage. This is mostly like just showing you guys the idea of what the model looks like, right? So you can tell I mean, I changed the face a bit. I know I wanted it to have kind of a weird jaw that could open. I also split the mandible thing here later on to have it looking kind of like an ant, which is also where, you know, the Canopus ant name comes from. And yeah, you see these legs are just taken from a previous model and just fit to this model, right? So it's all about saving time, just getting the idea in and yeah, roughly defining what it is that you want to do for the model. It's a good idea to add a floor usually because you know you can ground your model slightly so it's not just floating in space. I like doing that. And yeah, tools I use again, it's just, you know, clay buildup and strokes like this. You want to go in the direction of the muscle usually, so you get these striations. You can smooth it out and, you know, you get like a detailed look. Some damn standards sometimes, you know, defining certain creases or areas. And that's about it. I mean, clay tubes you can also use, right? I think for this kind of stuff here. And not much more than that, just basic sculpting. All right, back to the presentation. Next up, we have the high poly process. Here we just finalize the sculpt of the model. We polish and add details using alphas and other techniques just to get, you know, high density details that we then bake down onto the model. Let's open ZBrush and let's go through that. Okay, back in ZBrush. This is the final high poly model for the Canopus ant. Although I think I'm not using the highest resolution just, for performance sake since I'm recording. But I think it just still gives you a good idea of the kind of details I have, the amount of them as well. Let's zoom in here on the face and let me talk about it a little more. So as you can see, there's two meshes here, right? So there's one like this, which is just a refined version of the blockout, right? So it's just taking things a bit further, defining things, right? So this is like stuff like damp standard, just accentuating the shapes I already have, and not much else. And then the other mesh here serves as like a detailed pass. So I did this because I was trying out a technique I saw in the ZBrush Summit. I think it was the Square Enix one, the recent one in 2024. No, 2023, sorry. Ooh, time flies. Um, Here the inner mouth, right? Nothing special. You can see I've opened up the mandible here as well to get a better bake. The eyes are done with Noisemaker, right? So over here in Surface, Noisemaker, you add noise. If you have the right pattern, you can get some cool stuff. And that's pretty much it. I also use a variety of brushes that I have like in my organic detailing kit. Um, I use brushes like, for instance, this Volume Square Enix thing. I made that also just inspired of a ZBrush Summit presentation years back. But what it does is, it cuts in, but it also extrudes out. See, it's very good for scales and that kind of stuff. You get some nice shapes. Um, then what else? Some alphas and stuff. This is the detail mesh as well. Oops, sorry about that. Get back to this one. Yep. Other than that, I, poly paint the model just to get a better idea of the texture as well. So when I turn off the poly paint, you can see it also simplifies the model in general. But yeah, it just helps me visualize the model final look essentially, right? Um, what else? So yeah, the detailing kit, it's a lot of alphas as well, but most of this is hand sculpted. And then the other mesh, which is done essentially by like grabbing the model you have and then decimating it, right? So you can see the decimation here. Then you smooth it with this, but turning off the smooth modifier. And then you get these weird shapes that you can then mask by smoothness or cavity or peaks and valleys. And then you just inflate them slightly. And you get this nice like breakup of surface, which really like helps in terms of the input maps for the model. So you get like nice curvature maps that you can use to detail. I also, when I did my bake, I added a separate color completely to this mesh and to the other one, right? So like if I do that here, I can show you real quick. Um, let's say we go something contrasty like this, right? But you see that then I have essentially a selection of all this red stuff um, inside of Painter. So I can define colors there, right? I can paint exclusively on these parts and paint something else on the detail layer, right? So you get some nice shapes, for instance, and this kind of stuff, which is pretty cool. I still want to experiment more with this technique. It was my first time using it, but it's pretty cool. I do recommend trying it if you haven't. And yeah, I think that would sum it up for the high poly. Next up, we have the low poly. This is where we take the high resolution model and rebuild it with topology that works for the game or project. For this, it's very important to be in sync with your rigger, right? If you're rigging yourself again, I mean, you're, you have to make sure that it deforms correctly. This is already second point. And Then once we have all the topology done and we build everything out, we can unwrap it and then start creating the textures for it. One other thing I forgot to mention about the low poly is that, especially in real-time engines, it's important for, AAA models and stuff like that to really maximize your poly count budget, right? So if you're given a budget of, let's say, I don't know, in this case, I mean, let's say it was 80,000 triangles, right? Getting up to those 80,000 triangles is important, because you can capture like a lot of shapes, which will then show up as shadows or create shadows inside of the engine, right? So normal maps, one important thing to know about normal maps is that they just fake lighting direction on a model, right? So you can have like details like scales and all that kind of cool stuff, but they won't actually create like real shadows. So they won't really cast shadows. They just, fake lighting information. So they'll go dark when they're in darkness, but they're not going to create a shadow. So that's why you see like I built out a lot of the scales here on the model and a lot of the spikes over here, just so that when I lit it, I had, real shadows that were casting from those shapes. So yeah. Um, Textures. So here we define the physical properties and colors of the model in Substance Painter. If you have a good model, I think many color combinations can look good. An important thing to keep in mind is that you focus on contrast in your maps, right? So the most important part is like here in the roughness, you see like there's some darker areas and there's some light areas, and they're like all kind of spread out throughout the model, although they have, certain areas, right? So here I'm having it more rough or less rough, so to speak, sorry, which creates more of a specular highlight, right? Because I want to guide the eye across these ridges and all the spiky protrusions and stuff like that. So I'm keeping the other areas here a bit more dry, so they're not as important to the eye. So not everything stands out, right? Like you want to focus the attention of the viewer somewhere. Same thing for the patterns, right? You can see the color map is almost similar to the roughness, where like I have more interesting stuff here on the outside and the patterns and on the top part than down here on the chest, for instance. And again, also roughness values or anything like any of these tech input maps, you can always change inside of the shader later on. For game projects, you want to avoid doing that, but it is possible to. It's better to just have like a nice map that just works. But on personal work, I usually always adjust my map inside of the shader, add some more contrast maybe, or you can add a map range node with which you can change the value specifically. So if you want it to be less shiny or more shiny, things like that. Here we are in Substance Painter. I'm just going to quickly run through what I do or what I did in this case on the model. So you can see I have two texture sets. They're pretty low res, as it is usually for games. Um, yeah, you can see there's an emissive layer over here. I like organizing stuff into these kinds of folders. Folders are always good. Usually when I'm working professionally, I also color code them, right? So you can right click and, just color stuff. I think this is great if you're working in a team because, yeah, it really helps someone else to like organize it visually for themselves, right? Like if you need to pass the file to someone else, this is something that's very important, especially working for bigger studios. Let's turn off the glow here on the body. Give it a moment. Yeah. So let's talk a bit about the maps. You can see the base color, there's a bit of dust here, but I try to put a lot of color variation in there. Just, using all sorts of different fill layers and, accents. Sometimes I use base textures from stuff. Here I'm using some smart materials, and yeah, that's pretty much it. It's all just using the the masks, right? So for instance, this accent, this one's painted. So is this one here. This one is using a light bake filter. So is this one. Here we have the curvature information being used, right? Again, some more like noisy stuff just to break up the model. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on. Dots, pattern. Like this is the overall pattern that you kind of see. And when you blend it all together, you get something nice and complex like this. As you can tell, the spike is literally only one spike. So I just used one spike, I unwrapped it, and then I placed it using geometry nodes inside of Blender because I thought that was just, easier, and I'm a lazy modeler. So I don't want to texture a lot of spikes. So I used that, and then using the emissives and stuff, I had a lot of control over it inside of Unreal Engine and stuff. The eyes are pretty basic as well. They also have some emissive stuff on there because I thought it'd be pretty cool. And yeah, I do export the texture in 4K for the model, but because my PC is not that great, I like texturing at 2K because the viewport is fast and stuff like that. HDRI is Studio Tomoko, which is one of the best ones in my opinion. And yeah, masks, base color, metallic. You can see there's a bit of metallic. Usually game studios hate it when you do that, but since it's my personal project, I kind of like it. I think it gives it a nice kind of different feel. Since it's like a weird creature, it's kind of alien, sci-fi, fantasy kind of stuff. I have no problems breaking physicality. But when you're working on IPs or big video games, you definitely want to check in the documentation if that's allowed or not. And then the roughness, as I was explaining earlier, it's just capturing certain parts that you want to kind of highlight, right? So you make them a bit shinier um, by reducing the roughness essentially in those areas when you have scratches, you want to have all sorts of information that you can put on here because it all kind of affects the model later on. Even if you can't really see it here, I think it really pops up in renders later on. Um, in Substance Painter, it's also like you can change the quality of the shader. The higher you go, the more laggy it becomes, but the more accurate it is. And you can also see in this case, I'm using a color space. I'm using ACES for Unreal Engine 4, which kind of helps keep my colors more accurate to what they would look like inside of Unreal Engine, basically. And yeah, that's about it for Substance Painter. All right, and for the renders, we set up the mesh in Unreal Engine 5, prepare the lights, cameras, and start taking some images. These are different lighting setups here. So, different purposes. This is more like a studio kind of setting. This was like mimicking one of those National Geographic shots I had on my reference board, which I think was kind of fun. Same lighting situation here. This was completely different lighting, and here it's a more atmospheric, like, night kind of foggy kind of canyon walk situation. I'm gonna open up Unreal Engine now and show you guys around the scene a bit. Okay, so this is the Unreal Engine 5 scene that I used to render. You can see there's a few lights, the model is in here, and that's about it. It's quite basic, quite simple. Um, there's some particles flowing around. Those are set up inside of the engine with NS particles. And then all the environment is just a lot of mega scans assets. And then there is a volumetric cloud um, for some of the volume. One thing to note is, there's emissives over here. So let me just go into the materials. So I made this general parameter over here where I can change the individual settings of the emissive for different parts, right? So I can increase the eye separately. I can increase the spikes as well. And I have some on the body as well if I want to do that, right? I can also change the color. I didn't set it up to control the color individually, but yeah, I still think it's a pretty fun effect, right? I mean, I don't really show this off in the final model, but again, sometimes it's just fun to set things up and play around, right? Because in the end, I think especially personal projects should always be fun. Um, and yeah, you can see the textures here as well, right? So I did try to go detailed. I added extra details inside of the textures and the shader, just to pop everything a bit more. And for the angle or like the distance that I look at stuff, I think it works pretty well. All right, now let's go through a few of the presentation shots. So, this is just a quick sequence where I essentially just turn on the emissive controls I showed you earlier and turn them off, but, go through the model to show you guys what it looks like. Here is another shot where it's just a, basic camera movement with some heavier volume fog. Yeah, pretty simple stuff. Here, sorry, 1 second. Yeah, this is just a quick GIF, right? Also just showing off the controls, the features, some more images, some more shots. These were done in a separate environment as well, right? So I just like testing the model in different environments. Here, shot with a more direct frontal, like strong light, as if, like the sun was shining into the canyon kind of thing. Some more close-up shots, you know, having some movement in there as well. Some back shots or, just certain angles here. Um, and yeah, low poly rig, and that's about it. All right, welcome back, and thank you for listening. I hope this helped some of you. I wish I could have gone more in depth into a lot of the topics, but the presentation would have just gone way out of hand in terms of time. I hope you guys still got something out of this. And again, I'm very happy to YCFCG for sponsoring this talk. Thank you for listening.